played this, and you'll hear this in a few minutes here. And very important that the demeanor and the training of this individual. The fellow at the call center had been trained how to handle this. And of course, he handles calls all the time from various characters on the scene. As he said, some are intoxicated, some just call up to order pizza. So this is the kind of environment in which he works. And he was talking to Zimmerman. And one important thing here is that supposedly Zimmerman had pulled up there, and he was profiling, and they did get the word profiling in Tranyvon Martin. And Zimmerman alluded to Tranyvon Martin and who he was. He said he looked black, and then later in the same call he said he is black. So in other words, he had a preconceived notion there, and this will come out in the edit. This is a little edited version. This is from Channel 9 out of Orlando. If you can check that out, it's about 2 hours of testimony there. But I pulled out some of the highlights. But nonetheless, in this 911 call, this is the famous one, not 911, well, non-emergency call, we'll say, to the Seminole County Communications Center, not to be confused with a 911 where there's an actual emergency going on. In other words, someone is being shot. It could be a problem that requires paramedics, heart attack, something of that nature. But nonetheless, they walked this witness through his training, through that particular call, and how Zimmerman sound. Well, Zimmerman talked sort of almost in a monotone. He wasn't excited, but he said, well, these young punks always get away with that, and with things, as he said. And it portrays him as a vigilante. And of course, defense is trying to normalize things as much as possible. So you get a give and take in this particular part of their presentation, which is very important within itself as to how they are trying to present to the jury. There were some objections there, and hopefully you'll hear some of those. But the judge basically overruled the objections. Now, the objections were from the state in terms of what evidence they had put forth there, which is fairly powerful. Now, this is direct evidence. We talked about direct evidence as opposed to, say, circumstantial things. Well, this is direct evidence because they had the video to back up what their claims were. This is the state of Florida. So where the defense is here, the defense is just trying to deflect as many things, and unfortunately Judge Nelson allowed the defense to attempt to lead the witness and to trip up the witness, we'll call it in the normal layman language. And the witness evidently had been well versed, because before the witness all the witnesses appear there, they have been subject to depositions, which is where they are interviewed by the various attorneys, and attorneys have the answers from the deposition in something called discovery. So discovery has already been in this particular case, so those things are all already laid out, so they anticipate where the answers are. And in a criminal trial, actually even a civil trial, your witnesses, these are the ones the state called, they went over their testimony and how they would react to things. And of course this young man is employed by the Seminole County, so he's been very well coached in how to answer. One of the most important things there is that they don't tell, in terms of Zimmerman, to stay in his truck, because then they would be liable. But what he said was, we would not want you to do that. In other words, Zimmerman wanted to follow the person, and evidently he did. Now, in our introduction, I'm not going in complete order here, you heard from the family attorney, Benjamin Crump. And one important thing stands out there, and if this proves out in the evidentiary situation, they took DNA samples from Tranyvon Martin's body, particularly things like his fingernails and his skin. They could not find any DNA from Zimmerman on Tranyvon Martin. So in other words, if Tranyvon Martin had scratched him or had hit him, and there was some bruising supposedly on his knuckles, Zimmerman's DNA would be there, because his hand knuckles would have made contact with Zimmerman's hard head. And that's going to be a very important part of the contention going on here. So we'll have to look to that part of the testimony. And then the day ended with an official from Miss Rump from the communication center, and what she was basically doing was explaining how calls are classified. They have numbers that relate to the case. In this particular case, there were a number of 911 calls after the actual incident. So that will continue tomorrow from various other parties. And these were 911 calls and not the so-called non-emergency call, but they're basically the same. In other words, the methodology for handling the two calls are identical. But what she was looking at was the calling records, when they started, duration, from which numbers they are, and the operators verify the number. In other words, your number is 222-2222. They ask you what your number is. Now, if it's a landline, they have instant identification on 911. But now on the non-emergency, which Zimmerman called, they would not have this. And of course, he called from a mobile phone. So anyway, they sync those numbers together. And Zimmerman then gives his home address and said, well, I don't want to do that, but he does give his name. So in other words, this whole questioning of the 911 person was to try to get the state of mind. What the problem was, the only thing the 911 person could say is, excuse me, is how he interpreted the audio that they had there. And as far as tone, well, he can only say, well, the man was speaking as I am now. He was not particularly agitated, but the state did get out of him, this is a 911 operator, that in effect the description that Zimmerman gave, that he was hostile to Mr. Martin. And then back to the communication center operator, she gave that particular rundown, but also at the same time she gave to the court, or the jury in this case, the entire lowdown as far as other calls Zimmerman had made. So they wanted to make this. Let me just back up just a little bit here, so we'll get this chronology exactly right here. The 15-year-old was Chad Joseph. The young man was the son of the girlfriend of Tranyvon Martin's father. So we'll get those names. We didn't have the names in there, so we'll go back and make sure we get those. Now, the next witness was a 7-Eleven person. His name was Andrew Gou, G-A-U-G-H. So we went through Mr. Gou, nothing out of the ordinary there. And of course, his father is Tracy Martin. And the highlight from the opening statement, and Attorney Don West, and this is something very important to remember. We were going, and we'll put this in our description, but nonetheless, Don West, he's an attorney. He made a joke that was not funny, and this joke is basically the same joke during the O.J. trial. If you remember, knock, knock, who is there? O.J. But I'll read what he says. West says, knock, knock. West says, who is there? George Zimmerman. And then George Zimmerman, who? Oh, good, you're on the jury. Well, we'll see what you think of that particular thing, but that was nonetheless what he did. The prosecutor in the case that was there was John Guy, and he talked about the profanity-laced thing, and that he was an F-punk. I think we talked about that in that part of the testimony. And also there, and we didn't watch the whole trial live, But Guy goes on to say there's no evidence to back up other claims by Zimmerman, including that Martin had his hands over Zimmerman's mouth, because they couldn't find the DNA. Now this is important here. Guy said none of Zimmerman's DNA was found on Martin's body. This is the same thing Attorney Crump stated. I just wanted to make sure that this has actually had been entered in to the record, and now it is part of the record. Also said Zimmerman's claim that he had to fire because Martin was reaching for his firearm is false, since none of Martin's DNA was on the gun or the holster. Now, another important thing here was that Zimmerman claimed that Martin had his hand in his waistband. Now, if he had this hooded sweatshirt on, the hooded sweatshirt should have went down below the waistband of his pants. He would have had his hand in the pocket of the hood. In other words, sort of like what quarterbacks wear, where they can warm their hands. I finally found one of those things, a little different. In my time, the only people that worked outside wore those particular type of hooded jackets, and quarterbacks wore the ones that had the pocket to put your hands in. And the woman I was going with at the time had one of those, and I actually saw one live on her. It was obviously a little different there, but nonetheless, there's some of the things that came out in day one here. I think we basically covered the witnesses as they were there. And the last witness said, what happened at the last part of this trial was an argument over introduction of these records. Now, the judge clearly said when they were introducing the records that they were, and of course they always state number 214, whatever. And there was no objection from O'Mara. Well, then O'Mara objected as Ms. Rump was testifying there, and said, well, basically what they're doing is portraying Zimmerman as a troublemaker. Well, he knew this to begin with. So this is kind of the style that he has portrayed, sort of a back and a forth. So this is where we are on day one. Very important, because this opened up the case. They started to lay out their case. And in my analysis, I was limited to what Channel 9 had, which is roughly about 2 hours. Didn't watch the trial live. But these things will come back, and of course in the closing statement you will get some of the same things going on that occurred here, particularly this DNA, and that's very important. If he had marks on the back of his hands, and it's not alleged Tranyvon Martin was wearing gloves, and these so-called marks on the back of his head. Now remember, when Zimmerman, at first they questioned Zimmerman, but they did not arrest Zimmerman. So thus some of these so-called problems, Zimmerman could have hit his head on the pavement himself and got those scars, because if Tranyvon Martin would have hit him, would have been a stick, and they would have found that. There would be some cuts on Tranyvon, thus his DNA would be there. That's something that's not missed. One other thing we need to catch up on here, because we have these competing stories, very much competing with each other. Tranyvon Martin for the domestic consumption, but Mr. Ed Snowden appears again, and this is from the Chinese People's Daily, and it is the official organ of the Chinese Communist Party. And it said it was gravely concerned by Mr. Snowden's allegations the U.S. had hacked into many networks in Hong Kong and China, including the Chengdu University, which hosts one of the country's internet hubs, and Chinese mobile network companies. It said is taking issue. Not only did the U.S. authorities not give us an explanation apology, it instead expressed dissatisfaction in Hong Kong's special administrative region for handling things in accordance with the law. That is by Mr. Wang Yong, a researcher at the Academy of Military Science in the People's Daily Commentary. He goes on to say, since the United States has gone from a model of human rights to eavesdropper on personal privacy, the manipulator of a centralized power over the international internet, and the mad invader of other countries' networks.